The wind on Aurelian had not howled in years. It used to scream across the violet dunes like a wounded god. But ever since the sky fractured and the moons burned orange, silence had become the new sound of the planet, and Seren had learned how to listen to it, how to move within it like a ghost who still believed he had a body. He stood beneath the broken spires of what once was the central observation tower, the steel frame groaning gently under its own forgotten weight, and his eyes, those faded silver eyes that had watched more friends die than stars rise, fixed on the crater where the first signal had been received. He hadn't come back to mourn. No, Seren didn't mourn anymore. Not since the Muron tore through his command unit like smoke through lungs, and not since command had stitched a mission failure tag onto his back while pretending it was a medal. This was something else, something colder than guilt and sharper than memory. He had returned because the shard had pulsed again, because deep in the dead rock of this planet, something ancient had opened its eye, and it had called his name. Or something like it. Behind him, the soft static of a signal decoder crackled, its rhythmic bursts echoing against the half-buried steel walls of the outpost. Lyra had been sitting on a folding crate for the last hour, her fingers wrapped tightly around the thermal unit she had modified into a portable biosignal scanner, and though she had not said a word since they landed, her silence was not from disinterest, it was from grief, and maybe fear. She had lost her brother here. Everyone knew that. But what Seren had come to understand, after days of seeing her watch the dark horizon as if it might return him, was that she believed something had taken him, not killed him, but taken. Seren had tried not to care. He really had. Emotions didn't keep people alive. They just got them shot slower. But Lyra had something in her that reminded him of the past, not the war-torn, blood-slick past he tried to forget, but the one where people still fought because they believed in something bigger than vengeance. She wasn't military. She wasn't hardened. But she was unbreakable in ways that made him uncomfortable. "I'm getting echoes," she said finally, her voice low, as though she feared that the wind might carry her words to something listening in the dark. It's like it's breathing, the shard. It's alive, Seren." He didn't turn to look at her. He didn't want her to see how much that disturbed him. Machines don't breathe. I didn't say it was a machine. That made him glance back. She was sitting without any movement now, completely still except for her fingers twitching over the scanner's dials. And he could see that whatever she had read wasn't a random spike or glitch. There was structure to it, rhythm, intention. "Give me the readout," he said as he stepped toward her, his boots cracking the brittle crust of the ancient earth. She handed him the datapad without hesitation, but her eyes didn't follow it. They remained locked on the jagged outline of the crater below them, the one locals used to call the heart before the colony fell. He scrolled through the pulse wave patterns and felt his stomach tighten as he realized what he was seeing. 2 sequences, one layered over the other. The first was a code, pulsing in clean, modular fractals, something synthetic. But beneath it, there was something else, organic, almost like sonar, or ... heartbeat. The sky above Aurelian shimmered faintly as clouds gathered in unnatural swirls, though no wind moved. It had been like this for days. The planet was changing, and the shard, no matter what it was, had something to do with it. Seren could feel it pressing at the edges of his thoughts, like a scream underwater. "I shouldn't have come back," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "But you did," Lyra replied, quietly, standing now and stepping beside him, her gaze still on the heart. "Because it remembered you." He didn't answer her. He didn't have to, because deep below them, in the cracked earth and ancient bones of Aurelian, something had begun to stir, and it was waiting. Night on Aurelian did not fall gently. It arrived like a shadow dragged by claws, swallowing the jagged terrain in a darkness so complete it seemed to hum. The stars blinked uneasily above the outpost, as if they too were wary of watching what was to come. And down in the hollowed crater known as the Heart, faint glimmers had begun to pulse, in patterns that no human language could mimic. Lyra stood near the edge of the crater, her hands buried in her coat pockets, though the cold wasn't what made her shiver. She had not spoken much after analyzing the last reading, but she hadn't gone to sleep either. She was waiting for the shard to speak again. Seren sat just beyond the old Kun tower, his rifle resting beside him, untouched, though the safety was off. He could see her from where he was small against the monstrous vastness of the crater, framed in the dim shimmer of alien light, and he didn't like the way she leaned toward it, as if it had already started to call her by name. He knew obsession when he saw it. It had lived inside him once, back when he still believed in saving people who didn't want to be saved. "You should step back," he said without raising his voice, just enough to carry through the dead air. "I'm not afraid of it," she replied, her tone calm, steady, but her feet remained rooted at the edge. "That's not what I said," he muttered as he stood up, brushing dust from his coat that hadn't even settled yet, walking toward her with that cautious stride soldiers never forgot even years after the war. When he reached her side, the light below them pulsed again twice, in perfect sequence. Lyra didn't flinch. Seren did. "What do you see?" she asked, her voice quiet now, almost reverent. He didn't want to answer. But the truth was no longer something they could afford to avoid. "It's sinking. With something. With me?" she asked without looking away. He glanced at her, then back to the glowing shard buried beneath the dust. "No, with both of us." For a moment, neither of them moved. The pulsing light seemed to reflect inside their eyes, like it was searching through them instead of the other way around. Seren had seen alien tech before biomechs, viral drones, sentient fog, but this was different. This was older. Not hostile, not yet, but not passive either. It was... Choosing a sharp static burst from the Kun tower behind them interrupted the moment, followed by a voice grizzled and unfamiliar to any listening parties in Sector Delta 5. "This is Captain Brask of the Northward Legion. We have tracked your signal. Surrender shard data or face orbital lockdown." Seren turned sharply, eyes narrowing. He hadn't heard that name in years, but it still came with blood in its mouth. Brask wasn't a soldier. He was a salvager turned mercenary. A warlord who rose from the bones of the Muran War by carving out what was left of destroyed colonies. If he was here, things were already worse than they had realized. Lyra looked at him, confusion in her expression. "You know him. He collects weapons. He's not here for research." "But we don't even have the shard." Seren shook his head slowly, eyes scanning the dark ridges. "We have something worse. We've made it wake up." The cum crackled again, more urgent this time. "You have 20 minutes to transmit coordinates. After that, we will assume hostile intent." Lyra took a step back from the crater finally, though her gaze lingered. "We can't let them get to it," she said, her voice tight with fear for the first time. "If they take the shard?" "They won't," Seren cut in. He was already moving, pulling his rifle up, checking ammo. "Because we're going to make them bleed for every meter they try to take." She followed him instinctively, even though she hated the idea of violence. But this wasn't about choice anymore. This was about keeping something ancient and powerful out of the hands of men who would turn worlds into ash just to prove they could dot as they entered the outpost's shattered shell. Seren's datapad lit up with a proximity warning 3 vessels. Inbound from orbit, cloaked but traceable. Brask wasn't bluffing. He had come with a small army. Lyra activated the emergency shielding, her fingers trembling for the first time since she had arrived. "Do we even stand a chance?" Seren looked at her, really looked, and then back at the shard's pulse, still glowing through the dark below. We do if it wants us to. And somewhere deep in the heart, the shard pulsed again. Twice then, once then. It weighted rain was not supposed to fall on our alien. At least not like this, not in slow, trembling drops that felt warm instead of cold, as if the sky were weeping something old and sentient. It soaked through the fractured panels of the cum station and slid down the scorched plating of the outpost like tears down the face of something dying. Seren stood by the reinforced viewport, jaw tight, watching the silhouettes of 3 descending. Vessels bleed through the clouds like devils with wings of steel. Brask had arrived. He had seen these kinds of landers before Black Fang class, modified for rapid deployment, bristling with hull-mounted guns and EMP nets. These weren't scouts. They were reapers. Seren didn't need to count the minutes. He had already memorized the sound of approaching war. Lyra was in the eastern corridor, syncing their data cache into an off-grid relay drone. Her eyes locked on the screen, even though her hands shook. She had not spoken since Seren told her the shard was reacting to both of them and part of her. Still refused to believe it. She had come here for her brother, for answers, not for war, and definitely not for the kind of choice that left blood on your hands, no matter what you picked. The drone lifted with a hum and vanished into the dark. Sky barely visible as it zipped beyond the crater. That was their only backup, their only proof that what they'd found wasn't madness. She stepped back, exhaled, and turned. Cade Oren stood at the threshold, her breath caught. It wasn't fear. It was recognition wrapped in disbelief. He looked. Older now, rougher. His armor wasn't standard issue. It bore the patchwork signals of someone who had been scavenging through dead war zones for years. The rifle at his side was active but not aimed, and his eyes, those green-gold eyes she remembered from command, briefings and fragments of Seren's. War stories were the same. Tired, calculating, unapologetically dangerous. Lyra, he said. As if her name had been collecting dust in his throat for too long she didn't speak. She only stared behind her. Seren's voice arrived like thunder from a higher place. You're a long way from stealing plasma cores, Cade. The mercenary turned, slow and deliberate, to face him. Seren Vortis, he said, his lips curling in a smile that didn't touch his eyes. Still alive. I figured the last planet that fell on you would have finished the job. Seren descended the stairs with his weapon lowered, but his expression unreadable. Lyra glanced between them, trying to understand the current pulling beneath. Their words. You're working for Brask, Seren said. Not a question. I'm working for myself, Cade replied. But the Legion pays well. And they don't ask questions when I say I'm walking into the mouth of a living planet. You always were good at betrayal, Seren muttered. I learned from the best. Silence stretched between them, not empty but brimming. There was something personal here, something rooted in battles fought and friendships burned. Lyra stepped forward before they drowned in it. Why are you really here, Cade? He looked at her then, and some of the sharpness in his posture dulled. Because what you found down there, it's not just alien tech. It's alive, and it's not just reacting. It's reaching out. To who? She asked. Cade turned to Seren again. To him. A siren wailed from the upper deck one of their perimeter drones had triggered. Brask's troops had landed. Seren didn't wait. He grabbed Cade by the collar and slammed him into the wall with the practiced fury of a man who had no time left to waste. Are you here to warn us? He growled. Or to lead them right to us? Cade didn't resist. His voice came through clenched teeth. I'm here to stop this before Brask activates the shard. How the hell would he even do that? Because he already has the second one. The world shifted on its axis in that moment. Lyra staggered back a step. The shard in the crater pulsed violently, like a heart seizing in terror. Lights flickered. The floor trembled. Cade looked directly into Seren's eyes. He's not just here to steal it. He's here to awaken whatever's buried beneath this world. And outside, just beyond the ridgeline, the earth began to crack. Something was coming. Not Brask, not his soldiers, something old, something that had once ruled the stars before silence buried it beneath time. And now, because of them all, it was waking up the ground, did not quake like a tremor or a fault line breaking apart. It trembled as if something buried beneath the soil had simply remembered it had bones again. It began as a deep, low groan, a vibration that crawled up through Seren's boots and into his chest, like a second pulse that did not belong to him. The lights in the outpost flickered again, then died completely, and for one perfect second, the only illumination came from the crater the shard's glow had sharpened, no longer gentle or rhythmic, but sharp, chaotic, almost angry. Seren turned. To Lyra, her face pale in the sudden dark, eyes wide, mouth slightly open. She looked as though she wanted to speak, but couldn't decide which fear to name first. Cade was already moving, pulling himself free from the wall, slinging his rifle over his shoulder as he activated his shoulder beacon. The soft red glow spread through the hallways of the outpost like blood tracing old veins. "You said he had the second shard," Seren said, keeping his voice calm as his mind calculated every possibility. How long they had, how far the lesion was, how deep the crater really went. "I did," Cade replied, tapping at a holopad on his wrist. "But I didn't say he knew what he was doing with it." "Explain." "Fast." Cade projected a crude scan into the Air 2 energy signatures, mirroring each other across planetary coordinates. The shards were not meant to be separated. Their reactive cores, linked, intelligent, alone, they pulse. Together, they awaken something, Lyra finished. Her voice barely above a whisper. Seren could already hear it now, something outside, beyond the steel walls and ash-soaked dunes. Something moving, heavy, slow, intentional. "We need to shut it down," Lyra said, stepping toward the map. "If the signals are linked, we need to disrupt the sync. Interfere with the bonding sequence before Brask aligns both frequencies." "Too late," Cade said grimly, pointing at the red signal. "He's already begun the resonance phase." There was no time to argue. Seren was already moving, snapping orders as he pulled gear from the weapons locker, tossing Lyra a compressed energy pack, grabbing the shard stabilizer from the floor. Vault a cylindrical device with exposed wiring and etched alien script, part tech, part guesswork. No one really knew how it worked. It just did. Lyra hesitated, then ran after him outside. The night had transformed. The sky no longer looked like it belonged to this planet. It had gone too dark. Not just the absence of stars, but the presence of something that had swallowed them. Thunder rumbled not from above, but from beneath. Cade followed without protest, his footsteps crunching alongside theirs as they reached the crater's edge once more. The shard was no longer lying dormant at its center. It had risen, hovering, several meters above the pit, twisting slowly like it was searching for a face. Lightning surged around its surface, flickering violet-white arcs that kissed the air with a sound that was almost singing. And then came the Legion Drophips crested, the ridge like silent birds of prey, their hulls matte black and bristling with weaponry. 4, maybe 5 squads of armored soldiers moved in tight formations, each marked by the sigil of the wolf's fang, each armed to turn this dead planet into scrap. At their center stood Brask, a towering figure in dark armor streaked with rust-red lines, a shock maul at his side, and the second shard embedded in a gauntlet on his left arm. He raised it high like a relic, and when its glow answered the one above the crater, the air split in two. The shard screamed, not a sound, not a noise, a scream. Inside their skulls, Lyra collapsed first, hands pressed to her ears, even though it made no difference. Seren barely stayed upright. Cade fell to one knee, shouting something through the mental firestorm. But no one could hear. The sky tore open above them. A shape emerged from the clouds. Not a ship, not exactly. It looked like a city carved from obsidian and bone, floating, without thrusters, lit by glowing veins of amber and cyan, pulsing like breath. It cast no shadow because it absorbed light itself. It had no engines, yet its arrival meant the horizon. It did not announce itself with weapons, but with silence so deep it stole words from the air. The Murran were returning, not as soldiers, but as something older, as something holy. Brask raised his gauntlet toward the floating monolith, unaware or uncaring of what he had truly summoned. Power, he shouted. Enough to break the empire, enough to crown a new dominion in my name. But the monolith responded with a single pulse, one blink of impossible light, and 2 squads of his men simply vanished. No fire, no explosion, just Seren pulled. Lyra back, stumbling behind cover, eyes locked on Brask. He doesn't control it, he hissed. He thinks it obeys. Cade crouched beside them, his hand gripping the hilt of a short blade. Then what do we do? Seren's gaze returned to the hovering shard, still rotating like a key in a lock. We don't fight it. He looked at Lyra, who was trying to breathe. We talk to it. Because if it remembered them, if the shard had reached for them before, it might still listen, and it was their only chance to keep this world from being reborn into something worse. Then extinction. The light from the monolith did not fade. It hovered in the sky like a memory carved into fire, too ancient to be dismissed, too vast to be comprehended. The moment it appeared, time seemed to stretch, pulled tight like the strings of some massive celestial instrument about to snap. Seren knelt beside Lyra behind the jagged steel lip of the outpost's lower trench, his pulse pounding louder than the shard's hum now, though the shard wasn't humming anymore. It was listening. Lyra's fingers twitched against the soil, as though trying to grip something that wasn't there. Her breath was uneven, her lips slightly parted, and when she opened her eyes, Seren saw something new inside them. Not terror, not shock, but recognition. Whatever that thing was in the air. Sky, it wasn't just calling to her. It was remembering her. We have to go back to the heart, she said, her voice hoarse like she had been screaming in a dream. Right into the center. It's not going to stop unless we complete the contact. You want to give it what it wants? Cade said from behind them, wiping blood from his lip and spitting into the dirt. That thing just erased 2 squads of Brask's men, like they were a smudge on a lens. You think it'll stop if we politely hand it a welcome gift? Seren wasn't listening to him. He was watching Lyra. Her skin was paler than before, her hands trembling more violently, but there was something alive in her now, something unbreakable pushing through her pain and fear. She had been marked by the shard, not just once, but from the beginning. He had thought he was the reason it pulsed. He'd thought it remembered him. But the truth was, it had always been her. The skies above cracked again, not with sound, but with pressure. A column of light descended from the monolith, slow and deliberate, piercing the heart's center like a needle through flesh. The shard responded instantly. Its color shifted from cold white to something else, something molten and alive, deep crimson edged with golden fire. Seren felt it in his chest, a heartbeat that was no longer his own. Cade, Seren said, turning slowly. If we don't stop this, it's not going to end with Brask. That thing isn't just waking up. It's judging. We triggered a response, and now it's deciding what to do with us. Cade looked toward the monolith, jaw clenched, his eyes unreadable. So what? We just give it Lyra? Hand her over like an offering? No, Lyra said, standing now with slow, careful movements. I'm going to talk to it. You're not a priestess, Cade snapped. This isn't a temple. It's a weapon. Lyra stepped forward anyway, her voice quiet but firm. Maybe, but weapons still choose their targets. Brask's men were repositioning. Their landers had dropped siege pylons at the crater's edge, anchoring into the rock with bone-jarring vibrations. Massive shield domes ignited, casting a shimmering barrier between the heart and the rest of the outpost. Brask had not fled when the monolith struck. He had stayed, not out of courage, but obsession. He stood at the far side of the pit now, his gauntlet glowing so brightly it hurt to look at, and when he lifted his faceplate, Seren saw a man who had already gone too far into belief to turn back. "Come forward," Brask called, his voice amplified through the speakers woven into his armor. "I know you feel it. I know it speaks to you too." Lyra didn't answer. She walked Lyra. Seren hissed, starting after her, but Cade caught his arm. "Let her," Cade said. "She's the only one it hasn't killed." Seren looked like he wanted to argue, but something inside him broke, instead something brittle he'd been carrying for too long. Trust didn't come easy to him, but this wasn't about trust anymore. This was about necessity. Lyra stepped into the shield barrier, and to everyone's shock, it parted for her like mist. Brask lowered his arm slightly, staring at her as though he'd seen her before, in dreams, or maybe in the memories the shard had forced into his mind. "You're connected," he whispered. Lyra walked right past him down into the heart. The shard hovered above her now, descending slowly, its spin slowing, its core pulsing not violently anymore, but softly as if breathing with her. She looked up at it, unblinking, and raised both hands. "I'm not your enemy," she said. Her voice was soft, but the shard heard her. Everyone did. A beam of light lanced from the monolith, striking the shard and threw it into Lyra. She didn't scream, she didn't fall, she stood in it inside her mind. The noise stopped. She saw visions, not images, not sounds, but memories older than Earth. Worlds sculpted by thought, species that sang their cities into being, star systems ruled, not by technology, but by understanding. She saw the Moran not as monsters, but as custodians of balance. And she saw how they had fallen, how their creations had turned on them, how they buried the shards not as weapons, but as keys, waiting for species who might one day be worthy. Monolith was not testing them for war, it was testing them for mercy. And now, Lyra ... She was the first human who had ever passed outside. The light vanished, the shard drifted down and landed softly in her outstretched hands. The monolith pulsed once and began to rise higher and higher, until it was nothing more than a fading star. Brask collapsed to his knees, his gauntlet cracked and hissing smoke. Cade lowered his blade slowly, and Seren he ran down into the crater, to where Lyra stood with the shard against her chest, her breath shallow, her eyes filled with starlight and tears. "I saw everything," she whispered, not to him, not even to herself, but to whatever still lingered above them. "They judged us," she said, and she looked at him, smiling through the exhaustion. "They forgave us." They didn't speak much after that, not because there was nothing left to say, but because silence had begun to mean something else now. It no longer carried the weight of dread or the stillness before battle. This silence felt sacred. Seren watched the monolith disappear into the upper reaches of the atmosphere, its glow retreating like a dying sun being cradled back into the void. The sky remained bruised and unfamiliar, but the shard no longer pulsed with anger. In Lyra's hands, it was calm, warm, even like an ember instead of a weapon. She held it close, though her arms trembled beneath its invisible weight. Not physical weight, the weight of memory. Brask's soldiers didn't fire. Not one. Many of them dropped their weapons where they stood, dazed, overwhelmed, as if the scream from the shard had burned through their cause and left only confusion behind. Brask himself had not moved. He remained kneeling at the edge of the crater, gauntlet shattered, eyes wide, lips barely parting as if still waiting for something divine to speak through him. Cade stood a few meters from Seren, not speaking, just watching the sky and the crater and the people between. His blade had not returned to its sheath, but his stance had softened, and the war that always lived behind his eyes for once seemed to rest. "We need to move," Seren finally said, voice low, almost reluctant to disturb what had settled. "This place won't stay quiet for long. Not after what just happened. We can't go back," Lyra said without lifting her gaze. "Not to the outpost, not to orbit, not yet." Seren turned toward her. "You're not safe here. Brasks. People might be stunned, but the Legion isn't going to let this slide. They'll regroup, reinforce." Lyra nodded once, slowly, but her expression didn't change. "Then we don't go back to them. We go deeper." "Deeper?" Cade asked, his voice catching with a grim kind of amusement. "What's deeper than waking up a god?" She finally looked up at both of them. There was something in her eyes. Now something old, not possessed, not alien. "But awakened, the shard showed me something else," she said. "This wasn't a test. It was a summons, a doorway. What rose above us, ... It wasn't everything, just the first piece. There's more. Below." Seren frowned, processing it. "You're saying this world wasn't just a hiding place. It was a lock." "Yes," she whispered. "And I have the key." Before he could respond, a dull vibration passed through the earth. Not violent like before, but steady, rhythmic. Directional southwest Cade had already turned toward it, eyes narrowing. "There's an old station down that way. Subsurface research base. Abandoned since the second wave of colonization. If something's buried deeper ... that's where they'd have studied it. Or tried to. Then we go." Lyra said simple as Seren looked at her, then at Cade, and at the ring of stunned soldiers. Still guarding a prize they no longer understood. He made his decision before he could second-guess it. Pack light. Move fast. Avoid scanners. Brask lifted his head then, his voice hollow and broken. "You don't understand what you've touched." Seren paused, staring down at him. "No," he said, "but you never understood what you were waking up." They left Brask where he knelt his men would carry him when they recovered. Or they wouldn't. Either way, he was no longer the threat. The real danger was still waiting. They traveled through the night, leaving behind the heart in its crater, cutting through the broken plains of Aurelian's forgotten side. Dust clung to their boots, and the stars refused to blink above them. The wind carried strange whispers sometimes, words not made by human mouths. Cade led them through an old ravine, where survey drones once mapped mineral veins that hadn't been mined in decades. Seren walked beside Lyra, glancing at her occasionally, watching the way she held the shard, not like a weapon, but like a torch. It did not burn her. After 4 hours, they reached the mouth of a cave obscured by old tech wreckage and overgrown. Metal root vines. A console blinked faintly beneath the debris, till powered by some backup reserve buried deep in the stone. Seren approached, wiping dust from the screen. "Substation 017, he read aloud. "Last log entry 41 years ago." Lyra stepped forward, placing the shard gently against the console. The screen lit up instantly, access granted, and the door slid open. A warm gust of air greeted them, laced with something ancient-like. Metal, stone, and something else beneath it. Not decay life. Cade stepped in first, then Lyra, then Seren. As the doors sealed behind them, far below the planet's crust, lights began to awaken one by one like memories, lining a forgotten corridor that had not known footsteps in half a century, and in the shadows ahead, something stirred something. That had waited long enough. The descent into Substation 017 was slow, not because the path was difficult, but because every step felt like an intrusion, like they were walking through the lungs of something alive and sleeping. The air was warm, not with heat, but with breath, as if the station itself was exhaling softly after 41 years of silence. Lights flickered awake in staggered pulses along the ceiling, chasing their shadows ahead like warnings. The architecture wasn't entirely human. The walls were steel, but curved, subtly organic in a way that felt wrong. Bones made from metal, grown instead of forged. Lyra walked in the center, still holding the shard, which had shifted again, its glow muted, not fearful, but respectful, as though it too understood where they were. Cade moved quietly at the rear, weapon loose in his hands, but never lowered. He was watching the walls now, tracing faded symbols that weren't in any human language. Seren walked ahead, his boots echoing with soft, steady defiance. They passed. Sealed labs with shattered glass. Dormitories covered in dust, but untouched by time. And then the murals began etched into the curved walls, thousands of symbols carved by hand or claw, spiraling outward like language, like song. Lyra paused to run her fingers across them, a tremor traveling from her skin into the shard. It pulsed once, gently. A whisper followed. No sound. Just feeling. They were trying to speak to us, she said, her voice distant. But we didn't know how to listen. What the hell is this place? Cade muttered, his eyes flicking between symbols and shadow. Seren stopped in front of a large glass door. Its frame was cracked, scorched, as if something behind it had tried to get out. Or perhaps something in front had tried to break in. He reached out and placed his hand against the surface. The door hissed open. Beyond was a chamber, unlike anything they had seen. No metal walls, no equipment, just stone, smooth and white, veined with dim blue light that pulsed with the same rhythm as the shard. The ceiling arched into a dome with no visible supports. In the center stood a spire, slender, black, humming with unreadable runes. Around it, 7 other shards hovered in frozen orbit. Lyra gasped. Cade stepped forward, but didn't cross the threshold. Seren turned slowly to Lyra. They didn't bury one shard, he said. They buried a nexus. Lyra's breath caught in her throat. The shard in her hands pulsed wildly now, its light casting silhouettes that moved when they didn't. Her eyes locked on the spire. This is the core, she whispered. The center of the Muran network. The memory engine. What now? Cade asked, frowning. It doesn't store data. It stores choices, morality, behavior. It learns through us. It does. Wonderful, Seren muttered. A galactic conscience. But Lyra stepped forward, crossing the chamber as if in a trance. The shard lifted from her hands on its own, drifting toward the orbit of the others. As it reached them, a deep tone rang through the chamber, not from speakers, not from machines, but from inside their chests. A resonance suddenly. The walls shimmered, and they were no longer alone. Figures formed around them, not solid, not ghostly, but something in between. 7 tall, translucent forms in armor, unlike anything known to Earth. They bore the same curved design as the walls, their heads smooth and crownless, their eyes empty of light, but heavy with presence. The Miranut, living not dead, Echoes one stepped forward, its voice not heard but felt, a vibration through bone and blood. You have returned. The lost. Lyra trembled, but stood tall. We didn't know. Ignorance is not sin. Only repetition. Seren stepped beside her, instinctively protective. What do you want from us? The figure turned its head slightly. Not what. Wait for what? Cade said, finally crossing the chamber. Judgment? Salvation? A second extinction? The core is awake. The nexus seeks choice. Lyra stepped closer to the spire, the air around her shimmering. What choice? The figure looked at her, and only her who speaks for your kind. Seren grabbed her arm. Don't answer that. But Lyra didn't step back, because she knew the answer had already been given. "I do," she said. The Muran nodded once, and the spire opened. From it came not a weapon, not light, not fire, but a fragment of memory. Pure, unfiltered thought. It poured into her, not in words, but images, feelings, patterns. A library of a lost species, a map of their rise, and the secret that had brought them to extinction. They hadn't been destroyed by war. They had been undone by choice, by believing themselves incapable of corruption. And now the core offered that memory to hear a gift, or a test. Her knees buckled. Seren caught her. The shard floated back into her hands, and her eyes, when they opened, were glowing. "The Muran aren't coming back," she said, voice distant. "They were never supposed to. But what they left behind was meant to live through us." Cade looked between them both, unease etched across his face. "You saying we're their heirs?" "No," Lyra said, breathing heavy, tears on her cheeks. "I'm saying we're their gamble." And in the stone above them, a new symbol carved itself into the wall, one that hadn't been there before. A human hand touching an alien flame. The chamber felt different now. Not heavier, but deeper, as if space itself had folded inward to witness what had been set in motion. The last symbol etched into the wall, human hand touching alien flame, still glowed faintly, not with fire, but with recognition. Across the walls, the ancient Muran runes shimmered in sequence, like a heartbeat waking up after centuries of stillness. Lyra stood at the center, surrounded by the 7 orbiting shards and the spire that had given her memory, vision, and something far more dangerous. Choices hadn't let go of her. Even now, as she stood steady on her own, his hand hovered just inches from her shoulder, unsure whether to catch her or pull her back. Cade paced the edge of the room, restless and unarmed. Now his weapon had shorted out the moment the core activated, not broken, just ... "Dismissed. They've made their decision," Lyra said softly, her voice no longer just her own. Something echoed beneath it, a second tone, alien, ancient, calm. "They've chosen not to return, not to rule, but to allow a voice to carry the weight of what they were." "And they picked you?" Cade asked, unable to keep the doubt from his voice. "They didn't pick," Lyra replied. "We came. We listened. That was enough." Seren looked at the shard in her hands. It no longer glowed erratically. It was quiet, still. "So what now?" he asked. "What happens to us? To Earth? To our alien?" Lyra stepped forward, toward the spire, the shards slowly lowering around her like guardians at rest. "The memory engine is transmitting," she said, "across the galactic band, not to call anyone, but to warn them." "Warn who?" Cade demanded. "There's nothing left out there. The Muran are gone. The Empire's collapsed. Half the colonies are ash." Lyra turned slowly. "No," she said. "They're not all gone. They're just waiting to see what we do next." The spire hummed, and the walls shifted again, not with visions this time, but with maps. Entire galaxies rendered in blue, and gold light, constellations marked by Muran glyphs and ancient coordinates. But some systems pulsed now new signals. Faint, distant, but alive. "They were never alone," Seren whispered. "The Muran, they seeded more than relics. They seeded watchers," Lyra nodded. "Sleepers, sentinels." Cade stared at the map, his bravado finally stripped down to bare truth. So this wasn't the end of something. Lyra shook her head. No, it was the test before the beginning. Outside the chamber, deep within the tunnels they had passed, machinery long dormant stirred. Doors opened. Lights flared. And far above the surface, the floating monolith, now barely visible in the sky, sent a final signal outward, then collapsed into itself like a star folding in reverse, leaving behind nothing but a single blinking coordinate in the air. Seren stepped beside Lyra, his voice low. "They'll come for us now, won't they?" "Not to destroy us," she said, watching the glyph fade, "to see if we deserve to survive." She turned toward him then, something entirely human in her eyes again. "And if we don't, they won't need weapons. They'll just leave us to ourselves." The chamber dimmed. The shards returned to orbit around the core. The walls sealed behind them as they walked out of the depths of the nexus and into the new light rising over Aurelian's horizon. The air smelled different, cleaner, warmer, as if the planet itself had been exhaling for years and could finally breathe again. Cade was the last to emerge. He paused at the entrance and looked back one last time. "You think anyone will believe this?" he asked Seren with a tired smile. "Doesn't matter." "Why not?" "Because it's already changing everything." Lyra stood at the edge of the ridge, watching the stars blink in daylight. Not all of them were stars. Some were listening, and some were coming.